Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming along and listening to my talk. I am thrilled to have been asked to be part of TechFest this year, and today I want to talk to you about my career as a scientist and how we can all start to think outside of what I like to call the science career box. So, firstly, I thought I would introduce myself briefly. So, my name is Soph, or some of you may know me as Soph Talk Science. You can find me here on Instagram or Twitter or via my website, sophtalkscience.com. Please feel free to get in contact, or if you have any questions after the session today, please do get in touch. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions then. So, I am a molecular biologist and science communicator, and I currently work for a medical research institute based in London. Now, I'm more than happy to talk about all different science topics. After all, that is what I do for my day job now. But when it comes to talking about myself and my journey, that doesn't come quite as easily to me. But alas, that's what we are going to do today. And I wanted to take you on a little trip down memory lane with me as I share with you how I got to where I am today. But first, I have a little question for you. So if you have a pen and paper handy, or maybe just jot something down in the notes on your phone or a document on your laptop, I want to try and capture your initial thoughts. So it's not a tricky question. I don't want you to overthink it. So when someone says the word scientist to you, who or what is the first image that pops into your head? What do you see? What are some of the things that you think you need to be in order to be a scientist? And then what do you think that person that you're imagining does from day to day in their job? So I'll give you a few more seconds to think about that, or jot something down. And please feel free to share some of your thoughts in the chat or the comments below if you so wish. But I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit, and I'm going to guess that your thoughts might look a little bit like this. So you're probably thinking of an older white man with white frizzy hair, lab coat, glasses or lab goggles maybe. He's a pretty smart dude, he's intelligent, but maybe you think he is a little bit dull and boring, and maybe not even very friendly. And he spends all of his time in the lab doing experiments. How did I do? Okay, so this is a stereotype and I may be over exaggerating it a little bit. But what I hope to do is by the end of this talk today is tell you a little bit more about what my career as a scientist has been like and is like. But also hopefully I can help you start thinking outside of this science career box, just as I did as I went along my science journey. So let's take it back to the start of my journey. My friends, if they ever see this, will hate me for these photos, but alas, we will continue. So I was born and bred in Wales, in beautiful Pembrokeshire, if anyone knows of it. I had very little exposure to science growing up, just what we got taught in schools. That's probably the length and breadth of it. The science was always one of my favourite subjects though. It always seemed to capture my imagination and I always wanted to know more. To be honest, I was probably one of those nerdy kids that loved school and I loved most subjects, to be honest. I loved sport, I loved learning languages, but I also made sure that I didn't lose the creative things that I loved doing when I was choosing my GCSE subjects, for example. I made sure that I had music in there. And I also took on art as an additional one because I wasn't ready to give that one up yet. But it was biology that I really loved. I remember learning about genetics in school and becoming fascinated by how all these molecules in our cells are so active and so quick. So we often look at our bodies and think they are just a static mass of cells, when in reality, if you're looking at the molecular level, our bodies and our cells are always in motion. There's always something going on, whether it's our DNA unwinding to be copied, or proteins being shuttled from one end of the cell to another or between cells, or your antibodies rushing to shut down a bacterial or viral invasion. So I remember seeing this video animation of a protein pulling along cargo in the cell. Now this video makes it look like this process is happening really, really slowly, when in reality, this needs to happen in microseconds so that our muscles can move and we can do things that we don't normally think about, like walk and talk. So I was in awe of how the molecules in our body could do this so quickly, and so naturally I wanted to learn more and more. So to do that, I thought I had to become a doctor, a medical doctor. And probably very naively, I didn't realise there were actual research scientists out there in the big wide world, people who were working on these things like cells and molecules. But even if I did, I had no idea how little old me could actually become one. So I thought the only way that I could learn more about biology was to study medicine. Fast forward to sixth form, and I was really realising that being a doctor wasn't really for me. So instead, I decided to do a degree in a biology subject and see where I could end up, and just see what I could do with it at the end of my degree as well. And this sounds quite scary, but I was okay with that because I just love learning, and I knew that at the end of it, I would have learned a lot more biology, which just made me happy. So I went off to the University of Bath and studied molecular and cellular biology. My degree was 4 years long. I spent 3 of those studying as normal at university, but my third year I spent in industry. I did a year of research at Public Health England, and this was a complete revelation to me. I spent Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, doing scientific research, and I loved it. I loved discovering the results and learning about the science that way, just as much as I loved learning about it at university. But those 4 years came and went in a flash. We had finished our exams in final year and were waiting graduation, when I thought to myself, okay, you've reached the other end of your degree now, but you still have no idea what you want to do as a scientist or with this degree. So panic stations started to hit a little bit. What on earth was I going to do? I couldn't really just go back home because there was no science going on there, so I wouldn't have progressed anywhere. I'd always loved the idea of being a writer though, and I still do. It's a life goal of mine to write and publish a book, but I had no experience in writing back then, let alone writing about science. And I had no qualifications to justify applying for any of these sorts of jobs either. So for now, I stuck to what I knew. I had enjoyed my time in research, so I embarked on a PhD at the University of Southampton. And just as I had said to myself when I was finishing school, I said that I'm sure that by the end of my PhD, I would have more of an idea of what I could do with a science degree, and also then what I wanted to do with a science degree. But I didn't want to completely give up on the writing though. So I thought I would play around with writing as I was doing my PhD to try and get some of my own experience, and I set up a blog called Sophie Talks Science. So for my PhD, I studied embryonic stem cells. So this little picture is a view of the colonies of stem cells as I look down the microscope. So these cells are incredibly special cells because they are what we call pluripotent. So that means they can become any cell type that you find in your body. The best way for me to probably describe them is they're like the blank tiles that you can use in a game of Scrabble, because you can play them as any letter of the alphabet. So I won't go into too much detail now about stem cells, but if you did want to learn more, you can listen to my TEDx talk that I did earlier this year. You can go watch it on YouTube now, well, maybe after this talk. But yeah, it's called Marveling at Stem Cells. And if you wanted to learn more about my stem cell research that I did in my PhD, you can head to my website and there's a quick explainer video under the About my PhD research section as well. But there is one moment from my PhD that changed my life forever, and it had nothing to do with being in a lab or anything to do with a discovery from an experiment. So I was in the second year of my PhD, and one of the requirements was that I had to enter this 3-minute thesis competition. So this is a competition where you have a single slide. I think I've got mine here to show you. This is my slide that I produced. There's no animations allowed, and I had to summarize my whole 4 years worth of PhD research and what I was trying to achieve in that time into a 3-minute pitch that could be understood by anyone. Oh, and I also had to learn it off by heart, ideally as well. So that, because in 3 minutes there was no time for fumbling around and tripping over my words as I seem to be doing now. So the thought of this absolutely terrified me. Not only did I hate public speaking, which is quite ironic looking back now, but also I had no idea how I was going to get all this crucial and important details across and make people care about the research that I was doing, especially when I wasn't working in something like cancer research or Alzheimer's research, which people can understand or relate to a little bit more. So I kicked up every fuss that I could to get out of this competition. I was concocting all sorts of plans to wriggle out of it because I was just terrified of humiliating myself. I really just did not want to do this. So when it appeared that my options were running out, I resigned myself to the fact that I'm just going to have to do this. So I finally ended up with a script to accompany my slide that we have here. And I spent many hours of my PhD sat in a dark room. So these are the same kind that you see in films where they are developing photographs with the red light. Hopefully you know what I mean because I can't take any photographs in there. But I used the same stuff then to develop the results from a technique that I used a lot in my PhD called Western blotting. Anyway, this meant that I often spent a few hours a day sat in this dark room. It was a locked room with only me and my blotters inside. So I used all this time to rehearse my script over and over again until I knew it inside out. And when competition day finally arrived, I would have to deliver my talk in the light for the first time to an audience, and it actually went surprisingly well. I even got a few laughs, which were intentional with the way I had written things, and it actually went so well that I ended up winning the competition. But I told you that this moment changed my life, and how, you might be asking? Well, despite the fact that I had kicked up such a massive fuss about not doing it, going through the whole process of writing a creative script about my science, getting some giggles from the audience, and getting some recognition for my efforts, it actually made me completely fall head over heels in love with it. So this is a form of science communication, something that I'd never heard about before, and something I soon discovered that I could have a career in, a career that brought together my identity as a scientist with my passion for creativity. It was this moment that made me reignite my blog, which had fallen by the wayside as I started my PhD. It made me do loads of research, not into stem cells, but into creative science careers that I could have. It made me realise that I get a buzz from finding fun ways to communicate science, and I could still learn about new things at the same time. And from that moment, I knew that when I finished my PhD, I would go into science communication. But again, just like at the end of my degree, I had no experience in this. So I spent the final 2 years of my PhD not only finishing my research in the lab, but gaining as much experience as physically possible that I could in science communication so that I could get that job that I wanted at the end. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what I'm talking about, I wanted to quickly answer this question: what is science communication? So I'm pretty sure that most of you, if not all of you, know who these two people are. These two people are probably amongst the most famous science communicators in the world, but especially in the UK. The job as a science communicator is to share the latest and sometimes very complex scientific research and information, and share it in an entertaining, compelling, and sometimes emotional way that non-experts, someone who hasn't studied science and research all their life, can understand and care about. Science communication is that practice of sharing science-related topics with non-specialist audiences. And now that doesn't mean just through TV and Netflix documentaries that these two individuals might have created. Science communication can take many, many, many different forms. It could be the news articles that you've been reading about coronavirus over the last few months, the science books that you like to read, social media posts, podcasts, science festivals that you like to attend, pieces of art, and so on and so on. But it is about bringing something creative to tell the science story. So what did I do alongside my PhD? So you know that I write a science blog, And I wrote about science topics, but also about my life as a research scientist. And then I also started to share more educational posts on Instagram, where I'm privileged enough to have grown an incredibly supportive community that I would not have been able to finish my PhD without. I wrote articles for magazines, I did 2 science communication internships, I organised the Pint of Science Festival for many years, I spoke at Soapbox Science. This is where I use Marvel superheroes and a game that I created to tell people about the stem cell research that I was doing, and I was doing this on the beach in Brighton. I appeared on podcasts, I gave talks to community groups, and even partnered with companies to promote science education and simply being curious and inspiring curiosity. So balancing all of this alongside my PhD research was tough, to say the least, but I managed it. And every experience gave me more and more skills, and I learned so many lessons from all the mistakes that I made. But I was now equipped to apply for those science communication jobs that I had my eye on at the end of my PhD and when all of that was done. And all of this was because of that 3-minute thesis competition that I didn't want to enter. So it just goes to show that magic really can happen when you step outside of your comfort zone. So what do I do now? So as I mentioned at the start, I work for a medical research institute in London. It is my job to share all the research that my incredible colleagues are doing with the world. I write articles about all sorts of topics, from artificial intelligence to the microbiome, to neuroscience, to the gut-brain axis, to cancer, to evolution, and so many more. I create videos about the science sometimes and about the experience of the people who I work with. I look after all the social media. I organise events so that our local community can learn about the research that's going on behind the doors in the lab. We hold science art exhibitions, and I often liaise with the media to try and get our research covered in papers and on TV potentially, and so much more. It's so exciting that I have so much variety in my day. It's cliche, but no 2 days are ever the same. But I still get to learn every day about the latest medical research too. Now you might be asking, can I still call myself a scientist even though this is what my day job looks like? And the short answer is absolutely. There are so many skills that I learned by doing research and training to become a researcher through my PhD that I still use every day now. Being a scientist for me is not about just doing research, it's about being curious and wanting to learn more and more. And I'm just lucky that I get to do that in fun and creative ways. So I want to start to wrap up now by saying what's next for me and for Sophie Talk Science. Well, I still love talking about science topics myself, so I still speak at events and I go onto podcasts and I do TED Talks recently. But a big passion for me now is to make sure that all scientists, whether they work in a lab or want to go into other science careers, have the training and skills that they need to be able to share their science with confidence and with impact. Because it's so important for so many reasons that I don't have time to go into now, that everyone has those skills. Every scientist has those skills to be able to level up their careers. I realised that a lot of what I've done was learned through trial and error and learning from my mistakes and experimenting with different things. But now I want to pass on what I've learned. I want to pass that on to as many scientists as possible, so they don't have to make the same mistakes that I did, or they don't have the lack of confidence that I battled through to try and get to where they want to get to. Because the end goal is to have as many science communicators as we possibly can. We don't just need one David Attenborough or one Brian Cox. We need everyone's voices to be heard. So I want to start providing training courses and workshops so that anyone who wants to learn more about telling science stories through whatever medium they want can get that training that they want, because it wasn't on offer for me and I really wish that it had been. And just a quick side note, you also don't have to be studying science at university or PhD level to be a science communicator. It's the stories you can have like in a pub or in a cafe with your family, and sharing the correct information properly, really. It's sharing that with anyone. So even people who are at school can tell science stories. People who are retired can still tell science stories. Science communication isn't just for the general public to consume. The general public can also get involved. But for me, I want to keep finding new opportunities for me to learn and build new skills too, because I'm still trying to work out which area of science communication I love the most as well. So I'm trying to find and get as much experience across the board as possible to then be able to narrow down into the one or two areas that I'm really, really passionate about. So to do that, I'll keep writing a blog, and I'm also launching a podcast next year. And maybe even one day I will find that idea for that book I want to write, or maybe even land myself a science column in a magazine or something along those lines. So you'll notice that all these things I've mentioned are most likely not what you thought a scientist would do. I would be willing to bet a fair chunk of money that when I asked you those questions at the start of this talk, that none of you thought or wrote down that a scientist would do lots of writing or liaising with the press or making videos about science. Now, that is not the case for all scientists, but for a lot of them it is. No matter what science career you go down, you need some sort of creativity, whether it's coming up with the latest experiment and designing that, or writing an article about it in a magazine. So I want to make sure that no one tells you that you can be a scientist but you can't be creative. You cannot have one without the other in any kind of science career. So I wanted to ask you those questions again. What or who comes to mind when I say the word scientist? What do they look like? What do they do day to day in their job? Hopefully your thoughts have now started to change by me telling you about what I do as a scientist and the path that I have had, so you can go and tell more people and help me to break down that stereotype. So hopefully now you might also think of younger people and women as scientists. Hopefully I've drilled home that scientists need to be creative, and they are a friendly bunch. But also, yes, some scientists do spend all day doing experiments sometimes, and there are some scientists that are out there making videos or TV shows or podcasts or art exhibitions. And now you know that that is a possibility. That possibility is out there. Maybe you can find a way for you or your family member or a friend to burst out of that science career box and find something that suits them and their passions too. So I want to thank you so much for listening. I hope that was insightful in some way. I'm happy to answer any questions now, or please do get in touch with me via any of these options too if you have any questions later on. So thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful evening.